CADE Ejecutivos. Welcome, CADE Ejecutivos, whose motto is Diverse Voices, One Peru. My name is Gonzalo Banda. Throughout this CADE, the main reflection have guided us towards the urgency of listening the diverse voices that disagrees many times, finding the breaches, and if they do not exist, building the bridges to improve cooperation between public and private actors. No, we have reflected on the need to contribute to a culture of dialogue and not a culture of confrontation. Next, I will lead the session that we have called Institutionalism in the Bicentennial of Peru. Inclusive institutions are not tribes, no, they are the opposite of a tribe. No, there are spaces where we meet dissenting voices which we often find difficult to hear and recognize. No, there is not point in silencing them because sooner or later they will appear. The world has changed and information is not longer the property of a privileged few. Inclusive institutions, no? That's what we are facing in this session. And for that, today I have the huge honor of introducing Anne Applebaum. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. She is also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She has also writing in Washington Post. She has written many important books, such as the last one, no, my favorite, no, The Twilight of Democracy, which explains with electrifying clarity why some of her contemporaries have abandoned liberal democratic ideals in favor of strong man cults, nationalist movements, and one-party states. No, she has also written Red Famine, Gulag, no, which narrates the story of the Soviet concentration camp system. Gulag won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction in 2004. No, she has lectured at Yale, Harvard. In 2012, 2013, she held the Philip Rothman Chair of History and International Relations at the London School of Economics. And Applebaum, welcome. The floor is yours.
So first of all, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry I'm not with you in Peru. I have been to Peru and loved it. My whole family loved it, and I hope someday that I can go back. Let me begin now by asking you, what comes into your head when I say the death of democracy? Do you imagine soldiers riding a tank into the capital city? Do you think of colonels occupying the presidential palace? What if I described to you a different scene? Imagine that I showed you a picture of Poland's constitutional tribunal, the Polish equivalent of the Supreme Court. What if I showed you that picture in March 2016, on the day that it struck down a law that had been passed by the ruling party, the law that demanded that several judges on the court be forced to resign illegally and unconstitutionally and be replaced by new ones, selected by the ruling party for their loyalty? What would that look like? You would see the Chief Justice at the center, the faces of the other judges, some national symbols. It would look like a court enforcing the law. But that episode was important precisely because of what you wouldn't be able to see, namely that the Polish government then refused to acknowledge the verdict. There was a standoff for many months, and then time passed. The chief won. It illegally replaced the judges as it had planned, people with no credentials. One of them is, in fact, a man who was a communist-era prosecutor back in 1981, the last time Poland had a dictatorship. But you might notice that this particular attack on democracy would look a lot like democracy. There are courts, judges, members of parliament, and elected government involved. And that's not an accident, because in the modern world, undermining democratic institutions from within is now the greatest danger to democracy. So most of the time, democracies are not overturned by generals or soldiers, but thanks to elected leaders, presidents or prime ministers, who subvert the very processes that brought them to power. And what is remarkable about this process is how across many time zones and many continents, it is so similar. The American scholar Larry Diamond has described something that he calls the Autocrats' 12-point program. And he's written that while the exact pace and sequence of these acts varies from one case to the next, the essence of the sequence is strikingly common across varying cases. The process always begins the same way, namely when one political party or leader starts with the demonization of the opposition, who are characterized as illegitimate, as traitors, as foreigners, or as elites, as opposed to the true people represented by the authoritarian leader or his party. Then it proceeds to the undermining of the independence of institutions, courts, the media, including public media, the state bureaucracy, the prosecution service, the electoral system, any institution that can hold the autocrat to account, and anything that can prevent him from being reelected. Sometimes it includes changing the constitution or otherwise altering the voting system to make it impossible for the autocrat to lose. But always it includes constant rhetoric designed to show that anyone who objects to these things, journalists, political opposition, civil servants, are traitors. What's really important about this pattern is that it is not ideological. It is not right-wing or left-wing. It can work with any ideology. I've already mentioned Poland, where the ruling party, called the Law and Justice Party, is a self-consciously right-wing party. It is openly nationalist, hostile to many of Poland's neighbors, and very closely aligned with a very conservative, even reactionary wing of the Polish Catholic Church, a part that actually dislikes the current pope because he is too liberal. And many of the leaders of Law and Justice are former anti-communists who became disappointed with modern Poland because either it didn't turn out the way they had hoped, or because they personally did not benefit from 30 years of democracy and rapid growth, or at least not as much as they thought they should have. But in case you imagine that this is only a right-wing phenomenon, let me remind you that other ideologies can serve exactly the same function. So in Venezuela, you will remember that a slow-motion assault on democracy was launched by a self-consciously left-wing leader, Hugo Chavez, one who called himself an internationalist, not a nationalist, who was openly anti-church. He once described Catholic bishops as a tumor on his country. But Chavez, like the leaders of Law and Justice, was also adept at turning dissatisfaction into anger and to anger at the system itself. Thanks at the time of his election to falling oil prices, living standards were falling in Venezuela in the 1990s, and countless corruption scandals triggered a legitimacy crisis. What is extraordinary is the degree to which the leaders of these two countries on opposite sides of the globe, with completely different and actually opposite ideas, did so many of the same things with the same intent. So both leaders used their first year in office to rid their countries of competent officials, to fire heads of state companies and state institutions of all kinds, and to replace them with inept and unqualified party members or sympathizers. Step by step, they both sought to politicize the judicial system. I've described what happened in Poland, but you may also remember that Chavez packed his own Supreme Court with comrades in 2004, and then again in 2010. In both countries, there have been threats to judges who ruled the wrong way. Chavez has had a judge arrested and imprisoned. In Poland, judges who make the wrong decisions can be punished or demoted. But courts were not the only targets. As the media began to report on his corruption and misrule, Chavez used his power to limit their freedom. Again, restrictions on the press was expanded to include anything written on the internet. The bar on banned speech became very high. In Poland, they've not yet been able to eliminate independent journalism, but the ruling party is trying. Just a few weeks ago, the state announced a tax on media advertising without even pretending that this was anything other than an attempt to limit the profits of independent newspapers and television, nor is anyone really hiding the long-term plan, which is to force media owners to go bankrupt or to sell their properties to businessmen friendly to the ruling party. In both countries, and I'm now saying this to you consciously as an audience full of business people, one of the groups that has been particularly affected by these changes was the business community. Because as it turns out, business needs impartial courts and it needs the rule of law in order to be able to rely on contract law, in order to be able to count on contracts being fulfilled, payments being made on time, promises honored. Businesses also need some form of media or some sources of good and reliable information. They need things that are true to be published. They need to be able to make decisions based on what is happening in the real world and not what is happening in the mind of the leader of the ruling party. The normally functioning systems of democracy are also good for business because they can mediate the very different ethnic and class interests in a given society. And yours, of course, has some very, very different interests. You have wide contrast between people in different parts of the country, people with very different backgrounds. But the democratic institutions are designed to help them to find compromises rather than to allow one group to dominate the other, a situation that's always unstable. Social compromise is also the basis of the stability that you need in order to be able to plan for the future. Political instability is bad for business. Yet in both Poland and Venezuela, the business community was often quite cowardly. So instead of joining the public outcry against the politicization of the courts, for example, many Polish companies simply went silent. They were afraid of antagonizing the government, whose favor they needed, for all kinds of things you can imagine, for contracts, for permissions. But the long-term result of that cowardice has been catastrophic. A worsening business climate has meant that many companies and individuals are now planning to leave the country. Much more unfavorable taxation and economic conditions are on the way. Poland has become less attractive as a place for investment. Right now, the currency is dropping in value. And obviously, I don't have to tell Peruvians what has happened to the economy of Venezuela. You can hear that from the Venezuelan refugees that now live in your country. So let me end with a plea to all of you to use these examples as a reminder of how important it is for you to be involved in these issues. Not necessarily in partisan politics. I'm not saying you should root for one party or for another, though of course you should do so individually if that makes sense for you. But as a community, as business leaders, you have a real interest in protecting the institutions of democracy in your country, the institutions that preserve a level playing field so that different parties and different interests can compete. You have an interest in the independence of the courts, for example, so that the court system is not politicized, so that judges are not bribed. You have an interest in the professionalism and competence of civil servants. You want the people who run your national bank, for example, to be chosen for their economic competence and not because they're somebody's cousin or because they're a loyal party member. You also have an interest in supporting and maintaining independent, professional, and sufficiently funded media because you need good information and so do your customers, your employees, your clients. Supporting these institutions is not taking sides in a political battle. It's defending the fundamental structures that make it possible to ensure that Peru remains a good place to live and work. I'll finish by saying, I know that you're at a very difficult moment in your country's political history, but that's exactly why your participation right now on these issues is so critical. And remember, The correct response to left-wing autocracy is not right-wing autocracy. The correct response is liberal democracy and the rule of law, because that's what's in all of our interests. Many thanks, and I look forward to the discussion and to your questions.
Thank you very much, dear Anne. It's been very enlightening for us hear you. I'm going to start with some questions. No, you have said in an interview and in your book, actually, no, after the first part, no, Twilight of Democracy, you have said, no, given the right condition, any society can turn against democracy. What do you mean about that? That we should expect that no one is safe in this world, and even in strong democracies as United States, for example, the things can get worse.
I wrote that not because I think things will definitely get worse, but because I think nothing is inevitable. And many of us over the last several decades treated the phenomenon of democracy, especially American democracy, European democracy, we treated these things as inevitable. Democracy had triumphed, it had defeated communism, it had proven itself to be the best political system of all. Of course, it would go on existing forever. But that meant that none of us, people like me, but also people like you, business people, none of us had to do anything in particular in order to make democracy succeed. We could just go on with our lives. We could write books or we could make money, and it didn't really matter. The professional politicians could get on with making the system functional. Actually, it's turned out that that's not true, that nothing is inevitable. Actions that we all take every day, this is what affects what happens tomorrow, not some law of history or some determinant, some force that we don't control. We do control what happens. And the history of democracy, as you know very well, in your country, is one that, of a system that rises and sometimes falls, that it succeeds and sometimes fails. The men who wrote the American Constitution knew this very well. They were reading histories of ancient Rome and Greece and of the democracies in that time. And they were trying to apply the lessons from that era to the present. The American Constitution was written in order to fend off what they imagined would be the challenges to democracy from demagogues, from potential dictators in the public, and from the kind of popularity that they can win. So, they always knew that this was a system that could fail. And so the point is not that I'm not predicting disaster. I'm not predicting defeat. I'm not saying that America will collapse, nothing like that. I'm just saying that it may turn out that supporting democracy and keeping it going may take more effort from all of us than we imagined. It's not something that happens automatically. It's a system that requires a lot of civic engagement on the part of individuals, on the part of companies, on the part of organizations. It requires a lot of effort to keep going. That's always been true. We just forgot that it was true for too long.
Thank you very much. You have said in an interview that being proud of being a Marxist or putting yourself in the tradition of the Soviet Union implies that you are very ignorant or that you approve of a bloody tradition and the death of millions of people at the hands of these regimes. No, we have at this moment in Peru, the leader of the ruling party proclaims himself like a Marxist. No, what are your reflections on this matter? Because it's very disturbing, very annoying, proclaiming at this time, no, Marxist with such an easy way.
So yes, it's true. It's true that if you identify yourself as a Marxist and you think of yourself as belonging to the Soviet tradition, either you don't know what happened and how that and what that tradition was, or you're willing to accept a lot of a lot of crimes and terrible acts. I don't know your the leader of your ruling party, and so I can't say whether it's ignorance or violence that appeals to him. You would have to tell me that. But I should also say that, you know, you know, he's not alone. I mean, there are many other leaders in the world who also refer frequently to Marx and Marxism. They're the leaders of China. They're the leaders of Cuba. They're the leaders of Venezuela. And so it may be that he's also influenced by them. I would say one other thing about Marxism, though, that's very important, which is that some of the language of Marx has a deep appeal, which appeals to many of us, even those of us who are Democrats. It seeks to appeal to our desire for a more equal society. It seeks to appeal to ideas about justice. As I said, I think that it's in practice, when people have tried to fulfill the Marxist dream, they've created, you know, concentration camps and mass death. But, you know, maybe in order to avoid demonizing your ruling party, maybe one should try to listen to what's propelling them in the direction of Marxism. I mean, is it some kind of desire for justice, or is it a desire for total power? I don't know the answer to that. I'm just saying that there could be a way to listen to what they're saying that doesn't necessarily imply that they're leading your country, you know, in the direction of the Soviet Union.
In all this global scenario with climate change and all the things that are going on, democracy, it's important for citizens, no? Especially considering the rights, according the polls in Peru, economic revival, it's very important. And it somehow means that what we should face in the next years is like an environment with a lot of polarization. No, the far left and the far right are like trying to provoke each other. No, how to avoid that trap? No, because in your book you are very good describing this kind of polarization that happened in Poland. No, how to avoid that and to implement a culture of dialogue.
So first of all, you are correct that polarization is now a problem, not just in Peru, but in the United States, in the United Kingdom, you know, in France, in Germany, in Poland. It's now a phenomenon of modern life. You know, there are many reasons for that, which we can discuss. Probably the most important is the transformation of the information system, which has allowed people to sort themselves into echo chambers or filter bubbles, so that people only get the news that they want and they only see the facts that they agree with. And the problem then becomes that people don't just have different opinions, which they've always had, but they actually have different versions of reality. They actually live in different realities. And as you say, this is very dangerous for democracy, precisely because polarization is an important source of distrust. If you believe that only your side is correct and everybody on the other side is a traitor, or an elite or somebody who doesn't deserve power, then of course you can't let them rule. Of course you can't allow them to win an election. So polarization, by its very definition, is bad for these neutral institutions that I was speaking about, that we need to preserve the conversation and consensus in society. And so your question is exactly the right one. There's no obvious answer, which is, how do we bridge these gaps? How do we bring people together? How do we find common topics of conversation? And people are, you know, I have this conversation now with everywhere I go. I was recently in Spain, where I met several Spanish politicians. We had exactly this conversation. I recently met with Donald Tusk, who's the former Polish prime minister, who's now the leader of the opposition once again. We had exactly this conversation. The question is how to reach across divides and how to bring people together. Some of the answers people come up with is, first of all, a return to a discussion of real facts. If you're talking about jobs and the economy, if you're talking about things that people can see and feel, and you can get people to focus on those things, and how do we build a better road, or where should we put the bridge, or how should we invest our money? When people are talking about those things, then they're not talking abstractly about Marxism or about culture wars. They're not imagining one another as enemies. And so the more you can bring the conversation down to real issues that affect people in real life, the better off you will be. I mean, this incidentally was the theory of Joe Biden's political campaign last year. It was focused very, very clearly on the economy and not on broad culture war, divisive issues that divided Americans. The second point, and this has also been used as a kind of electoral tactic, is to talk about patriotism. What are the things that we're proud of in our country? How can you bring people together around the ideas, what we've achieved in the past, what we can do in the future? The French president, Emmanuel Macron, has tried to talk about modern patriotism as a way of bringing all of France into one conversation. What are the things that unite the nation? What are the moments in history that unite the nation? What are the sporting events, or what are the achievements that you can talk about that bring everybody together? And this may not be an obvious answer. It may require some thinking about which moments in the recent past or even the distant past are unifying rather than divisive. Focusing on those things and promoting those things, that seems to me the best way to bridge these divides. But I have to agree, it's very, very difficult. It's not going to be easy to pull people into a single conversation.
I always want to ask this question, because in Peru, somehow there are a lot of people that believe that communism is in the power, and you have sustained very strong points of view in that matter, saying that communism is not ruling in the world. Probably it doesn't exist anymore. What are your concerns about that, or what are your thoughts about that? Is communist or existing, or it's not anymore?
So the fictional communist state that was imagined by Lenin and Stalin does not exist and never existed. Instead, what the Soviet Union became was a very cruel dictatorship, very violent dictatorship where the enemies of the state were punished in camps and sometimes murdered in large numbers. Most of the existing states that call themselves communist, I mean, they vary. There's only 3 or 4 left, are either very cruel dictatorships themselves. Think about North Korea. Think about Cuba. Think Venezuela is a little bit different, but think about Venezuela too. Or they, in fact, they gave up pretending to be socialist countries or economies a long time ago. There's really nothing about modern China that has anything to do with Marx. I mean, sometimes, they like to talk about Mao as their national hero, the leader of China's communist revolution. But there is nothing in the nature of the modern Chinese state that looks at all like anything ever imagined by Marx or Lenin. And so while they use that language, as I said, that language can be deceptively appealing because it speaks of equality and some ideas that are appealing, I think, to anybody who lives in the post-Enlightenment or even the post-Christian world. but China is not a Leninist paradise or a Marxist paradise by any means. It's a country of capitalism and state capitalism, which also in its own way is very cruel. So the idea that communism somewhere exists, and if we could only do it differently or better this time, this is of course a myth and a fiction. That continues to be perpetrated, by people who are looking for some alternative to democracy that doesn't exist.
Thanks for that answer. But some way we have to establish some alerts, no, that we should take into consideration, no, because our institutions in Peru are not as strong as they could be, no? What are these alerts, especially because in Peru, for example, we have a precarious, chaotic, left-leaning populism, no? The government in this moment who wants to promote constituent assembly, who wants to change the mechanism, no, of the reformation of the constitution. And I think that we can establish like bullets of alerts. What could be that alerts in general ways?
So I think the first and most important thing is to listen for this language of populism that I spoke about in my introductory remarks. So when any political party starts talking about itself as the only legitimate party, only we have the right to rule, nobody else has that right, and all of our opponents are traitors, foreigners, elites, people who aren't real Peruvians, that's a bad sign, because that's the language that a political party uses, which is going to try to change the rules to keep itself in power. That's really the first bad signal. The second signal is there can be constitutional changes that are legitimate. I mean, our constitutions are old; they need updating. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's important to watch out for constitutional change that is itself unconstitutional. Breaking the rules or altering the system without popular consent, without political consent, and without buy-in from different parts of the society and different parties, that can also be very dangerous, because then you create a legal vacuum, kind of empty space in which whoever's in charge makes up the law. So what you really want to look for is any attempt to break the rule of law and to replace it with politics. So it's not the court that decides whether you're guilty. It's somebody in the government. That's an extremely bad sign. And then, as I said, I would always watch very carefully these institutions that have been designed to hold political leaders to account. And so that includes the courts. It includes the prosecution service. It includes the media. It also includes, if you have these in Peru, inspector generals, people inside the bureaucracy whose job it is to report on corruption or to inspect and make sure that things aren't going wrong inside the system. All kinds of people and institutions like that who are there to serve the public good and not to serve one particular political leader. Their power and their right to exist needs to be protected very loudly, because it's, again, autocrats and autocratic political parties very often seek to push back against precisely those kinds of institutions. So watch out for them. I mean, the warning signs will come when attempts to change the Constitution unconstitutionally, attempts to alter the judicial system so that judges are no longer independent, attempts to alter the media so that the media is no longer independent, attempts to undermine the powers of any kind of body whose job it is to monitor the system itself, to watch out for corruption. Those, I would say, are the most important things to listen for and pay attention to.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this marvelous opportunity to share with us your thoughts on democracy, on challenge we're facing on democracy, on institutionalism. For us, is being a huge honor, listening to you, and I'm sure that all the people who has attended to CADE are very happy to share with you at this moment. And let me conclude maybe with some reflections. No, um, I think that uh, what we are facing in all over the world is what you have called in your last Atlantic piece, why the bad guys are winning. No, the bad guys serve not some ideological concern, if not to autocracy, Inc. No, what you have claimed. No, and I think that's very prepared because at last, no, all the autocrats has that sense of remain in the power just for a self interest and not for the public good, no, and that's what we should try to avoid in order to protect our democracy.
Yes. Yes.
um, and if you want to share with us some final reflection, just is the time.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your excellent questions. I'm really delighted to be here with this group, and I really would like to conclude by repeating something I said in my opening remarks, which is the importance of business leaders understanding and being involved in the political lives of their country, not as partisans, not supporting one candidate or another candidate. Of course, you can do that privately, but as a spokesman for the importance of these institutions, as a reminder to the people who work for you, the people who work with you, of why we need them and why they need to be protected. People in the modern world are overwhelmed by information. They see so many different things on their phones, on TV, on their computers all the time, and they're looking for figures of authority and people that they can trust. And very often, business leaders can play that role. They are trusted by the people who work with them, by the people who look up to them. And remember that even if you're not in politics yourself, even if you don't want to be involved in political debate, you can play a role in talking to people, in speaking out about the need to preserve these kinds of neutral institutions, these inspectors, these judges, these journalists, for the good of the whole society.
Thank you very much, and it's been a huge honor for us. Thank you for all the person who has attended to this session. It's been a huge honor for us, and I leave you with the main session, and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.